Greetings, Destiny Christian Church, and anyone who's watching online today. We are recording this because this is part of a series, and we had a snowstorm recently, and so we didn't really record the message. We did something more spontaneous that morning. So we are in a series called Deconstruction, How to Question Your Faith Without Losing It. And today, I'm calling it, instead of part 2, part 1.5, because part 2 is next week, which will talk about the difference between questioning your faith and deconstructing. And today we're going to talk about that a little bit, but maybe with a different angle. But there's been a lot of talk about deconstruction the past few years. But there's a difference between deconstructing the faith and the faith crisis. Now, not everyone agrees with this. Some people say, well, Christians can deconstruct. I don't know how you can, only because of what deconstruction is, what it means, based on the French philosopher who coined the term in the 60s. And we don't want to get into that today, but the problem occurs when people use the word deconstruction to mean something that is totally different depending on each situation. And very few people really know exactly what the term deconstruction means, because the definition is always changing. And so there are some ways that people deconstruct. Some say, well, I call it the let's burn it down approach, right? All Christianity is messed up, so let's burn it down. And they tend to become atheists, agnostics, or spiritual, but not religious. And then there's the let's celebrate it approach. Deconstruction is good. Jesus did it, and so should we. Deconstruction is part of the growth process and discipleship. So let's deconstruct. So, everyone did it in the Bible, right? That's another approach. So here's another approach, the let's adapt it approach. Let's just follow Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount, and the rest of Scripture is kind of like irrelevant, because only what Jesus did applies. And any questions of morality, let culture decide on that one. Or there's this approach, let's question the religious system approach, which many people call this construction. I call it disillusionment or, faith crisis. Religious institutions have failed, but let's remain true to Christian orthodoxy. Let's separate religious traditions from the true Jesus. And so there are many people approaching it this way, saying, I don't want to leave Jesus, but man, the church stinks, right? And there are issues with that, because then it can create an individualized kind of worship that is separate from community. So that can be unhealthy, right? Then there's what I call the abandonment approach. Those who deconstruct are abandoning the faith. This is the view, especially because they tend to stray from the Scriptures and what the church fathers taught. I lean towards this view only because of all the deconstruction people I've read and all the threads I've read on social media. I've never seen one talk positively about God, really, unless I missed it. But very few, if any, talk positively about God. And there's such a bitterness, such a sourness when people talk about these things. The danger in our faith struggles is confusing the difference between deconstructing and having a religious crisis. And that's the problem. That's the issue there. So faith crisis versus deconstruction. Faith crisis looks something like this. In a faith crisis, the believer tends to disassemble all the things they believed in and valued, and then they reassemble it in a way that maybe is pure and more authentic, and maybe they might disagree with some of the stuff that they grew up in church with, or their parents taught them, or their faith tradition taught them, and maybe they'll go to another faith tradition. That's the difference. They assemble it back together, and it always leads back towards Jesus. Deconstruction is different, however. It tends to move away from the faith in general, not by disassembling, but by demolishing the faith to suit their own preferences. That's really deconstruction when you look at it closely. There are exceptions to this, but in my opinion, very, very few. And thank God that there have been testimonies of people who said, man, I was deconstructing and I was really lost and I came back to Jesus, But it's so rare. That's why I see deconstruction as a very dangerous, unhealthy thing. So let's talk about what it means to question your faith, questioning the faith. It's when what we believe and what we experience, right? What we believe, what we experience don't line up. And we ask questions. And a great example that I read from Jonathan Malesic, who wrote a book on burnout. And but I'm just borrowing his illustration and using it for my own purposes here, but giving him the credit. And he talked about a conflicted man as someone walking on stilts. And walking on stilts, he says, is the experience of reconciling one's ideals with their reality, right? Let's say your ideals are A, B, and C. I'm going to be successful. But then the reality is, well, this is the job I got. And when the two stilts are aligned, when both ideals and reality are kind of working together, it's great. You can move forward. But that doesn't make it easy, but it is possible to walk. But when the stilts are misaligned, right, when the reality is opposed to the ideal, to my dreams and values and vision, man, there's a problem. I can't walk, and I trip up and mess up. It's a great picture, I think. So is it possible? Think about the scriptures now, because I always want to bring the scriptures to bear in these things. Is it possible that the Bible is filled with people who saw a disparity between faith and reality? They saw a paradox between their faith and the reality, and they said, hey, I have all this faith here. I believe God. I'm in a covenant, but man, the reality is over here. It's not working. I believe yes. Look at Job. Job is filled with him criticizing God, the book. And at the very end of the book, God says, hey, Job spoke rightly of me. Even though he corrected him, but he spoke rightly of me, which means I believe that God was honoring the time tradition of lament, which Dr. Richard Middleton has defined as pain and protest. In other words, it is believed that Job was practicing the Hebrew lament, this pain and protest, in which we have a right as covenant partners with God to confront God and to say, Lord, this is my ideal. This is what I'm believing in. This is my values in you, my faith, my covenant in you. And then this is the reality. And they're not lining up. And this was a struggle with many people when you, through the Bible. I mean, just read that just about 1/3 of the Psalms written are called lament Psalms. That's amazing. That's mind-boggling, which means that this is a real problem. That's why God allowed scriptures to be written about lament. Paul the Apostle questioned the law-based faith of salvation that was taught his whole life after he encountered Jesus, of course. And he turned the law of Moses on its head when he taught that Jesus was the only way to be saved. That's questioning the faith. Because questioning the faith always leads back to God, right? Deconstruction leads the other way. Jesus questioned law-based religion in Matthew 5:20, when he said, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness goes beyond that of the experts in the law and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Jesus also said in Mark 7:9, he talks about human traditions, right? The washing of hands in this case. And they asked him, well, why don't your disciples wash their hands? They're supposed to do that today. It's part of our tradition, right? And he said to them, you neatly reject the commandment of God in order to set up your tradition. And these are the kinds of things that should be questioned. These are the kinds of things that invite faith crises where you say, hey, wait a minute, are people putting human traditions, right? Stuff that maybe we grew up with and the past 50 years we believed that maybe they have little or nothing to do with the Bible, or they have no value or fruit whatsoever. What about reformer Martin Luther, who questioned the state of the church at the time? Martin Luther questioned the church making itself rich by selling indulgences to the faithful on behalf of their deceased in purgatory. So basically paying it out to the church would lessen the sentence of their loved ones in purgatory. How messed up is that? So Martin Luther questioned that. He challenged it, right? It was a faith crisis. Dr. Martin Luther King had a faith crisis when every day he took the bus and he realized, hey, wait a minute, there's a disparity in races as to where we sit. There's this delineation mark. And thank God that he made the changes for people in general, not just African Americans, but every race, that all of us are created equal, right? So that was a faith crisis. And he went to the scriptures. He had a PhD in I think it was theology. Very brilliant man. So I'll say it again. When what we believe and what we experience don't line up, we ask questions. But here's the second thing I want to give you. Questioning our faith can lead to hypocrisy or even spiritual emptiness. So there's a danger there, right? I've seen people kind of question their faith and slowly get so far away that then now they're deconstructing to the point where they don't even know or believe in God. I've seen that. But questioning the faith, kind of where it leads to hypocrisy and emptiness, this happens when, on the one hand, we hold on to what we believe, and on the other hand, we see, or reality rather, says the very opposite. And we kind of discussed that a minute ago, but yes, we're holding on to our doctrines and convictions on one hand, but on the other hand, we're hollow on the inside and we're barren of life. We're just going through the motions because we'd rather be right than righteous. And spiritual emptiness happens when we move forward like a cold machine while ignoring the hard questions that we wrestle with honestly. Some people don't leave church because they don't know where else to go, not because they don't have serious questions or doubts. And they've gotten used to the Christian culture, but they become lost in it. And they might even go to church and lift their hands and worship and thank Jesus, but inside they feel hollow like a drum that makes very impressive sounds, but it's empty. That's why 1 Corinthians 13:1 says, if I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but I do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. So I can make a lot of noise, but is there love? Is there real truth behind it? Do I really believe it with my heart? Do I believe what I sing? Do I believe what I hear? Some look at the church and its ideals of how it's supposed to be loving, holy, gentle, and Christ-like. But instead, they find it to be the very opposite experience. But instead of questioning these things and challenging these things, some people just walk away and deconstruct and say, well, I don't want God. And even worse, some don't even question it. It just bothers them, and they brew on the inside so that it poisons their spirit, and they develop a hollow faith. And unless those questions are wrestled with and fought through with the scriptures and with spiritual counsel, that person can risk deconstructing. The faith, they can risk deconstructing their faith, but also deconstructing the faith. There's a difference between the faith and my faith. Instead of just questioning their faith, despair instead of hope for renewal will follow inevitably. But I also want to say this, that there's a warning to make certain you know yourself. Russell Moore once put it this way. He said, many Christians continue to believe what they've always believed, and they still belong to or lead the same institutions they always have, even though unaware to themselves, they are in a process of deconstructing their faith. In other words, there could be a person in leadership or someone who's a faithful Christian or faithful church member for a long time who have deconstructed or even, just kind of backslidden in their hearts and just kind of checked out. And they just keep going. And they just go through the motions of being faithful without any feeling. Is it possible? Just thinking of the scriptures again and the prodigal son, not the son himself, but his older brother, the one who at the end was balking about all the blessings his brother was getting. Could the famous prodigal son's brother have been in this category? He was doing everything right without missing a step. But when he was tested, there was this underlying bitterness that was exposed, that maybe he had deconstructed in his life, or he had maybe had these questions that he never challenged or asked, and went to God with lament and saying, God, I'm really struggling with this. But instead it came out in bitterness. So what is worse than having a faith crisis, not knowing that you are in it, but still living like you're not? And that's the warning. So deconstruction, on the other hand, looks different than the faith crisis. There's a vast difference between the both, between questioning your faith and deconstructing the faith, which is happening so much today. For instance, the first thing is this. In deconstruction, truth goes from being absolute to relative. That is like the one main component of deconstruction, man. That now truth is basically, it could be anything. You've heard the story of Humpty Dumpty. In Through the Looking Glass, the sequel to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Alice has this frustrating conversation with Humpty Dumpty. What makes the conversation so frustrating is that Humpty Dumpty, he's rejecting acceptable words or definitions of what words really mean, and he's making up his own words, right? And his own meanings. And he creates his own definitions. Words mean whatever he decides they mean. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a scornful tone, it means exactly what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. And this is what happens when you have relative values that were once truth, that you once believed was truth. That words become whatever you mean it to be. Scriptures become whatever you mean it to mean or not. Some people have rejected the scriptures totally. I am my own truth. And if the Bible and the teaching of the church fathers is no longer the template, then someone or something else will take its place. In modern deconstruction, it is usually the self. In other words, I'm my own truth now. I decide what words are. But I also want to say this, that hard questions become bitter cynicism. The church stops being an entity filled with real people. And instead, it becomes a cold institution, a thing to be objectified, attacked, and criticized. But so whenever people really criticize any church, and just kind of like don't think about the real people that are there, that's a very bitter thing to do. That's a deconstruction kind of attitude. But also, there's no path to repentance. Repentance is not on the radar of the deconstructor. Most people who deconstruct never see it as a situation that they have to make right with God, but instead they see it as a problem where all the fault is laid on a perceived evil, an injustice, a controlling system, or a group that was disenfranchised. That's the whole blame, but there's never responsibility. There's no responsibility ever taken. And so I'm going to end with this. Wood, hay, and stubble, or my soul? Which will it be? Will you question your faith and wrestle with the issues to get rid of that wood, hay, and stubble, right? The stuff that's not necessary, the human traditions, not the traditions of the fathers, right, or the apostles, but the human traditions that we make, and then we call that religion. Wood, hay, and stubble, or the vain stuff, or the empty stuff. So will you get rid of the wood, hay, and stubble, or will you deconstruct instead, risking to lose everything, your faith confession, the person of Jesus, your soul? So this is part of this series. In the next part, I'm going to be talking about the difference between deconstructing and faith crisis, but in more detail than even now. So I hope you enjoyed this today, and make sure that you check out the website, destinychristianniagara.com. You'll find podcasts. Lori has a great podcast called My Sheep Know My Voice, and Soul 02 is also one that I do. And also check out our Facebook and all of our stuff we get into there. So till next time, I want to thank you for listening today. Have a wonderful day. God bless you.